When my wife walked into the house that evening, her face lit up with an excitement I hadn't seen in a while. She had just returned from meeting her old friend, Samantha, the one with the kind of life that always seemed to spark some wild ideas in her. Without even taking off her shoes, she launched into an elaborate explanation of a plan that sounded straight out of one of those reality shows she liked to watch. "What if we moved to the countryside?" she said, her voice filled with enthusiasm. "We could start a ranch, live closer to nature, and just leave all this behind." For a moment, I thought she was joking, but the sparkle in her eyes told me otherwise. Samantha was a character, to say the least. She had money, big ideas, and apparently, a private stable in her backyard. It didn't surprise me that a visit to her place could inspire something like this. But the idea of abandoning our stable, comfortable life for some romanticized vision of ranch living? That was a different story. I stayed silent for a moment, waiting for her to say, "Just kidding." She didn't. Instead, she looked at me expectantly, as if waiting for my full support. "And how exactly are we supposed to pay for this grand adventure?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. My tone was calm, measured, the way I usually approached her more ambitious ideas. Her excitement faltered for a second, but she quickly recovered. "We could figure it out. People take out loans for these things all the time, and besides, it would be an investment in our future happiness." I shook my head. "I'm not taking out a loan to chase a dream that sounds like it came out of a lifestyle blog. We already have responsibilities here, and I don't think adding horses to the mix is going to make things any easier." I gestured toward the corner where our two dogs were sprawled out, completely oblivious to the conversation. "Not to mention, we've got 2 dogs and 3 cats already. That's plenty of animals to look after." Her smile faltered slightly, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of disappointment cross her face. I knew she had a tendency to get carried away when she got excited about something, but this felt different. This wasn't just a fleeting thought or a hobby she wanted to pick up. She was serious about this ranch idea, and the realization made me feel a mix of confusion and concern. "Look," I said, trying to steer the conversation back to reality, "this is the kind of thing that sounds good on paper, but it's a completely different story in real life. Running a ranch isn't just about feeding horses and enjoying sunsets. It's hard work, it's expensive, and it's not something you can just walk away from if it doesn't work out." She crossed her arms and gave me that look she always gave when she thought I was being overly practical. "You're always so quick to dismiss anything that doesn't fit into your neat little plans," she said. "Why can't you just think about it for a minute before shutting it down?" I sighed, keeping my voice steady. "I'm not shutting it down. I'm asking questions, the kind of questions we need to answer before diving headfirst into something like this. Have you even thought about how much land costs? Or how much work it takes to maintain a ranch? And what about our jobs? Are we just going to drop everything and become full-time farmers?" Her excitement seemed to dim, but she didn't back down. "I don't have all the answers yet, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. Samantha makes it work, and she's always saying how rewarding it is. Samantha also has a lot more money than we do," I pointed out. "She can afford to take risks like this because she has a safety net. We don't. And honestly, I don't think adding a bunch of farm animals to our lives is going to solve anything. It'll just create more problems." By the end of the conversation, it was clear we were at an impasse. She wanted something new, something exciting to shake up our routine. I wanted to keep things stable, predictable, and manageable. As much as I loved her, this was one of those moments where our differences were laid bare. I couldn't understand how she could entertain such an idea without thinking through all the practical implications. And she couldn't understand why I wasn't willing to take a leap of faith. For now, the idea was just that, an idea. But I had a feeling this wasn't the last I'd hear of it. Samantha had always been a polarizing figure in our lives. To my wife, she was a symbol of freedom and success, a woman who had everything figured out, from her sprawling backyard stable to her seemingly endless stream of ambitious projects. To me, Samantha was trouble. She represented everything that I thought my wife didn't need: impractical ideas, unnecessary risks, and an endless fascination with chasing fantasies. Every time my wife spent time with her, she came back with some new grand idea, and this ranch dream was just the latest in a long line of them. The first time Samantha came up with the ranch idea, I rolled my eyes. It wasn't the first time she had planted a seed of chaos in my wife's mind. My wife, however, seemed captivated by the way Samantha described her life. According to her, Samantha's backyard wasn't just a stable, it was a sanctuary, a place where life was simpler and more fulfilling. My wife hung on every word, and I could see her mind racing with possibilities. The problem was, Samantha's version of simplicity came with a hefty price tag, one we couldn't afford. I'd always been wary of Samantha's influence. She wasn't a bad person, per se, but she had a way of making my wife feel like our life together was inadequate. Every time she came back from one of their meetings, it was as if she was trying to escape the life we had built. Samantha had a knack for dressing up her ideas in a way that made them seem glamorous, but to me, they were nothing more than expensive distractions. It didn't help that Samantha's wealth allowed her to indulge in whatever whim struck her fancy. She didn't have to think about the practicalities, she just made things happen. One evening, after my wife had spent the day at Samantha's, she came home with that familiar spark in her eye. "Did you know Samantha's thinking about expanding her stable?" she said, barely able to contain her excitement. "She thinks we should consider doing something similar. It's such a great way to connect with nature and escape the stress of everyday life." I didn't bother hiding my skepticism. "Samantha can afford to expand her stable because she has the money to do it," I replied. "We don't. And frankly, I'm not interested in turning our lives upside down because she thinks it's a good idea." My wife didn't take my reaction well. "Why are you always so negative?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "It's like you don't even want to consider the possibility of something better." I stood my ground. "It's not about being negative," I said. "It's about being realistic. Samantha can afford to chase these dreams because she doesn't have to worry about the consequences. We do." The argument escalated from there. I pointed out that Samantha's ideas were often impractical and, in some cases, downright ridiculous. "Do you remember when she tried to convince you to start that online boutique? Or the time she thought investing in that wellness retreat was a good idea?" My wife bristled at the mention of past failures, but I wasn't trying to score points. I just wanted her to see that Samantha's influence wasn't as positive as she thought. But my words only seemed to make things worse. "You're always tearing down my dreams," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Every time I come up with something new, you find a way to make me feel like it's stupid or impossible." I tried to explain that I wasn't trying to tear her down, but the damage was done. She saw me as the obstacle, the one person standing between her and the life she wanted. By the end of the conversation, we were both too frustrated to continue. She stormed off to another room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that Samantha's influence was driving a wedge between us. My wife's determination to chase these ideas, combined with my refusal to entertain them, had created a rift that neither of us seemed willing to bridge. In her eyes, I wasn't just dismissing her ideas, I was crushing her dreams. After what felt like endless back-and-forth arguments about the ranch idea, my wife finally came up with a compromise. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, she calmly laid out her new plan. "What if I just spend time at Samantha's ranch?" she suggested. "I'll get my fix of animals and nature without us having to uproot our lives." I could see she was trying to meet me halfway, and for once, her idea seemed reasonable. Initially, I was skeptical. Samantha's ranch wasn't exactly close, and I knew my wife's tendency to dive headfirst into things. "So, you're saying you'll just visit?" I asked. She nodded, explaining how it would be an outlet for her without requiring any major changes on our end. She was adamant that this solution would satisfy her need for something new and exciting while allowing us to maintain the life we had built. I thought about it for a moment. The idea of her spending more time with Samantha wasn't my favorite, but it was far better than the alternative of taking on a massive financial and logistical burden. "Fine," I said finally. "If it means putting this ranch business to rest, then go ahead. Spend time there, but let's keep it reasonable." She beamed at my agreement, clearly relieved that we had reached some sort of understanding. As part of the compromise, I suggested something of my own. "If you're going to be spending time there," I said, "how about we also make some improvements here at home? You've mentioned wanting a garden before, and I think we have the space to make it happen." Her eyes lit up at the idea, and I could tell she hadn't expected me to offer anything beyond begrudging approval of her trips to the ranch. The more I thought about it, the more the idea made sense. A garden would give her a new project to focus on, one that didn't involve running off to Samantha's place every other day. It would also be something we could work on together, which I hoped might bring us closer after the strain of the past few weeks. We can start small, I suggested, and if it goes well, we can expand. Maybe even build a greenhouse. She was thrilled at the prospect. A greenhouse would be amazing, she said, her excitement growing. We could grow our own vegetables, maybe even some flowers. It'd be like our own little oasis. Seeing her enthusiasm made me feel like we were finally moving in a direction that worked for both of us. Of course, there were practicalities to consider. I reminded her that maintaining a garden, especially one with a greenhouse, would require time and effort. If we're going to do this, I said, we'll need to commit to it. No starting and stopping halfway through. She agreed without hesitation, assuring me that she was ready to put in the work. By the end of the evening, we had a plan that felt like a real compromise. She would visit Samantha's ranch to satisfy her love for animals and the outdoors, and we would create a garden here at home to give her another outlet for her energy and creativity. To show my support, I even offered to cover the costs of setting up a proper greenhouse, knowing it would make the project feel more tangible and achievable. For the first time in weeks, it felt like we were finally on the same page. The greenhouse was finally complete. It had been a project I'd thrown myself into over the past few weeks, thinking it might rekindle some normalcy between us. It was a sturdy structure, with enough space for vegetables, flowers, and whatever else my wife decided to grow. But despite the effort, I began to wonder if it had been worth it. My wife's enthusiasm for the greenhouse seemed to wane as quickly as it had appeared. She'd spend a few minutes there, inspecting the setup, before heading out again, always to Samantha's ranch. At first, I didn't think much of her trips. She'd come home glowing with energy, her cheeks flushed and her mood unusually cheerful. It was nice to see her happy, but something about it didn't sit right with me. Normally, spending hours outdoors with animals and physical activity left her tired, not energized. It was the kind of subtle difference that might have gone unnoticed if I hadn't known her so well. She started coming home later and later. When I'd ask about her day, her answers were vague, filled with non-committal phrases like, "Oh, it was nice," or, "We just worked on some things." It wasn't like her to be so elusive. Usually, she'd talk my ear off about the details of her day, whether I wanted to hear them or not. Now, it felt like she was deliberately avoiding specifics. I tried to brush off the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Maybe she was just enjoying the novelty of spending time on a ranch. After all, it was something new and exciting for her. But as the days went on, her behavior only grew more unusual. She'd leave earlier in the morning, claiming she wanted to help out more, and return late at night, always in the same chipper mood. There were small changes, too. She started dressing differently, opting for clothes that seemed more suited to impress than to work with animals. When I pointed it out, she laughed it off, saying she wanted to look nice while she was out. It was a strange explanation, considering she was supposedly spending her time mucking out stalls and riding horses. I began to pay closer attention, watching for any clues that might explain what was going on. Her phone became a constant companion, and she'd often step out of the room to take calls or reply to messages. When I asked who she was talking to, she'd wave me off with a casual, "Oh, just Samantha. We're planning things for the ranch." One evening, I decided to press her a bit more. "You've been spending a lot of time there lately," I said. "What exactly do you do all day?" She hesitated, just for a moment, before replying, "You know, the usual. Helping with the horses, tidying up, that kind of thing." Her tone was light, but the delay in her response didn't escape my notice. The more I asked, the more evasive she became. Simple questions about her day were met with vague, almost rehearsed answers. It was as though she didn't want me to know too much about what she was doing. When I tried to push further, she'd change the subject or brush me off entirely. By this point, her behavior had gone from curious to outright suspicious, leaving me with more questions than answers. Just as I was starting to think about getting to the bottom of my wife's strange behavior, life threw a wrench into my plans. Late one evening, my phone buzzed with an urgent call from work. It was my manager, explaining that there was a serious issue at one of our sites and they needed me to handle it personally. The job was straightforward enough, but the timing couldn't have been worse. Still, the extra pay was significant, and it seemed like a situation that could be resolved quickly. Reluctantly, I agreed. I packed my bags that night, running through all the reasons why taking this assignment made sense. I told myself that a few days away wouldn't change anything. If something was going on with my wife, it would still be going on when I got back. And besides, I needed solid evidence before I could confront her about anything. Right now, all I had were suspicions and a feeling I couldn't shake. The next morning, I left early, giving her a quick goodbye before heading to the airport. She seemed unbothered by my sudden departure, which only added to my unease. Still, I pushed the thought aside as I focused on the task ahead. The problem at work was exactly as I'd been told. Someone had broken a crucial piece of equipment, and another technician had failed to fix it properly. It was a mess, but not one I couldn't handle. When I arrived on site, it was clear that the team was relieved to see me. The situation wasn't as catastrophic as they'd made it sound over the phone, but it was enough to halt production and cause a backlog. I dove in immediately, assessing the damage and figuring out what needed to be done. It was tedious work, but nothing I hadn't dealt with before. Over the next couple of days, I put in long hours, making sure everything was repaired and running smoothly. The team was cooperative, and with their help, I managed to get the equipment back up and operational ahead of schedule. It felt good to resolve the issue so efficiently, and I could tell my manager was pleased with the outcome. With the job done, I started thinking about heading back home. My original plan had been to stay an extra day to ensure everything was working properly, but everything checked out during the final tests. There was no reason to stick around any longer. Besides, the sooner I got home, the sooner I could start addressing the growing concerns about my wife's behavior. I called the travel office to see if I could move my flight up. Luck was on my side for once. There was an earlier flight with an open seat, and they booked it for me without any hassle. Knowing I'd be home sooner than expected gave me a sense of relief. Maybe, just maybe, the extra time would give me a chance to figure out what was really going on before things spiraled any further. As I packed up my tools and prepared to leave, I couldn't help but feel a small sense of accomplishment. The job had been a success, and I'd managed to finish it faster than anyone expected. Now, all that was left was to get back home and focus on what truly mattered. With any luck, I'd find the answers I was looking for soon enough. As I pulled into the driveway, I couldn't help but notice something strange. The house was dark except for a faint glow coming from one of the downstairs windows. It was unusual. My wife always kept the lights on in the living room when she was home. Stepping out of the car, I felt a knot form in my stomach. I walked toward the house, my footsteps crunching softly on the gravel. That's when I saw it, a massive, dark figure moving past the window. It was far too large to be a person. My pulse quickened, and my mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Instinctively, I picked up my pace, nearly sprinting to the front door. My hand fumbled with the keys for a moment before I managed to unlock it. I pushed the door open with enough force to make it slam against the wall, my eyes scanning the dimly lit room. What I saw stopped me dead in my tracks. Standing in the middle of my living room was a horse, its presence so absurd that for a moment, I questioned if I was hallucinating. How in the world had it even gotten inside? And then my eyes shifted, and I saw her. My wife was there, too, standing close to the animal. The sight was both shocking and grotesque. She was unclothed and touching the horse in a way that made my stomach churn. There are things in life you can never unsee, and this was one of them. Disgusted and enraged, I fumbled for my phone, immediately switching on the camera. I needed proof. Whatever was happening here, it was beyond anything I could have imagined, and I wasn't about to let her deny it later. What the hell is going on here? I shouted, my voice echoing through the room. She jumped, startled, and turned to face me. For a moment, there was a flash of guilt in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by defiance. You have no right to barge in here like this, she snapped, as if I were the one out of line. The absurdity of her response only fueled my anger. No right? I repeated, my voice rising. This is my house. And you're doing this. The argument escalated quickly. She tried to defend herself, spouting nonsense about how I didn't understand and how I was overreacting. Overreacting? There was a horse in my living room, and she was acting as though I was the one being unreasonable. My mind struggled to keep up with the sheer insanity of the situation, but one thing was clear, there was no coming back from this. Do you have any idea how insane this is? I asked, my voice sharp and incredulous. She rolled her eyes, crossing her arms as though she were the one being inconvenienced. You've never understood me, she said, her tone dripping with disdain. You've always been too small-minded to see what I need. Her words were cutting, but I refused to let them distract me. I held up my phone, showing her that I had recorded everything. This ends now, I said firmly. But she wasn't done. Instead of backing down, she doubled down, her voice rising to match mine. You think you're so perfect, she spat. But you're not. You're nothing compared to what I want, to what I deserve. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was as though she had transformed into someone I didn't recognize. Every word out of her mouth was another blow, each one more hurtful than the last. And then she said it. Her face twisted in anger, she hurled the words at me like a weapon. I don't need you anymore, she said, her voice cold and final. Your stick is too small. It's always been too small. For a moment, the room went silent, her words hanging in the air like a toxic cloud. I stared at her, trying to process the depth of her betrayal, but there was nothing left to say. She had made her choice, and it was one I could never forgive. After the chaos of the confrontation, I knew I couldn't let this slide. My mind was racing, but one thing was clear, this situation required action, not words. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police. The dispatcher's calm voice asked for details, and I laid out the facts succinctly, sparing no detail about the bizarre scene unfolding in my own home. She assured me that officers would be dispatched immediately. Hanging up, I locked the doors and positioned myself near the entryway, ensuring my wife wouldn't have the chance to slip away before they arrived. The minutes felt like hours. My wife alternated between yelling at me to let her leave and retreating into silence. She made no effort to explain herself, and honestly, I didn't care to hear it. The bond we once shared felt irreparably shattered. My focus was on ensuring that this incident was handled appropriately and that she faced the consequences of her actions. The longer I waited, the more resolved I became. There was no turning back now. When the police arrived, their reaction was a mix of professionalism and visible disbelief. It's not every day they're called to remove a horse from someone's living room. I led them inside, keeping my voice steady as I explained what had happened. One officer stepped forward, taking control of the situation, while another began questioning my wife. Her responses were evasive at best, defiant at worst. Meanwhile, I handed over my phone, showing them the video I'd recorded. The officer's face hardened as he watched, and he nodded curtly before turning to his partner. It didn't take long for the officers to make their decision. They escorted my wife out of the house, her protests growing louder with every step. At the same time, additional personnel arrived to deal with the horse. Watching them guide the animal out through the front door was surreal, the absurdity of the situation almost overshadowing the anger and betrayal I felt. Almost. Once the house was empty of both unwelcome guests, I turned my attention to the next task at hand. The police assured me that my wife would be taken in for questioning and that the evidence I provided would be sufficient for further action. They left with her in custody, their flashing lights disappearing down the street. As the sound of sirens faded, the house fell into a tense silence. It was the calm after the storm, but it was far from peaceful. I walked through the house, surveying the wreckage of the evening. Every room seemed to carry the weight of what had just happened, a stark reminder of how quickly everything had unraveled. But there was no time to dwell on it. I needed to act. Heading to the bedroom, I began gathering her belongings. Clothes, toiletries, personal items, anything that was hers went into bags and boxes. My movements were methodical, driven by a mix of anger and determination. Each item I packed felt like another step toward reclaiming my life. There was no sadness, no regret, only a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about removing her things from my home, it was about removing her betrayal from my life. As I carried the boxes to the curb, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. She had made her choices, and now I was making mine. By the time I was done, the house felt different. It was emptier, yes, but also cleaner, freer. Her things sat in a pile outside, ready to be taken away like the remnants of a bad memory. Standing in the doorway, I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. The night had been a nightmare, but I was still standing. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I was ready to move forward. With my wife taken into custody, the police wasted no time arranging for a psychiatric evaluation. Given the bizarre and unsettling nature of what had occurred, it wasn't a stretch to suggest that her mental state might be a factor. They informed me that she would be transported to a facility for observation and assessment. I felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion, relief that the situation was being taken seriously, and exhaustion from the emotional toll of the past few days. As the dust settled, my focus turned to the practicalities. The events of the evening had made one thing abundantly clear: our marriage was over. I needed to protect myself and the life I had built. The next morning, I contacted a lawyer. His calm, professional demeanor was exactly what I needed to counterbalance the chaos. We discussed my situation in detail, from the video evidence to the house and other shared assets. His advice was clear: act decisively and prepare for a clean break. The process of filing for divorce was straightforward but far from simple emotionally. My lawyer emphasized the importance of securing my property and finances. He assured me that with the evidence I had, there would be little room for dispute. Together, we drafted the necessary paperwork and outlined a strategy to ensure the division of assets would leave me in a stable position. I made it clear that I wanted no further connection to her. This wasn't about revenge, but about moving on. While the legal process began to unfold, updates about her psychiatric evaluation trickled in. According to the reports, she was cooperative but defensive, unwilling to acknowledge the gravity of her actions. The professionals assigned to her case recommended a longer period of observation, citing concerns about her behavior and its potential implications. Knowing she was in capable hands offered me a small measure of closure, though it didn't erase the bitterness I felt. Back at home, I started taking steps to reclaim my space. I changed the locks and began redecorating, removing any trace of her presence. It was cathartic, a way to start anew after everything that had happened. Friends and family reached out, offering their support and helping me through the transition. Their words of encouragement reminded me that I wasn't alone in this, even if it often felt that way. The divorce proceedings moved quickly, thanks in large part to the overwhelming evidence in my favor. My lawyer's meticulous preparation paid off, and the judge ruled decisively. The house, my savings, and my possessions were secured. The relief I felt was immense. This chapter of my life, as painful as it had been, was finally coming to a close. All that remained was to finalize the paperwork and officially sever the ties. When the divorce was finalized, I felt an unexpected calm wash over me. It wasn't happiness, exactly, but a sense of peace. The chaos, the arguments, the betrayals, all of it was behind me now. For the first time in months, I could look toward the future without the weight of uncertainty dragging me down. The last I heard, she had been discharged from the psychiatric facility and moved in with her parents. From what mutual acquaintances told me, she was avoiding contact with most people, including her former friends. I chose not to dwell on it. Her life was her own now, just as mine was mine. What mattered most was that I had emerged from this ordeal intact, ready to rebuild and move forward with my life. After the divorce was finalized and the dust had settled, I made a decision that some might call extreme but felt entirely justified at the time. The video evidence I had captured during that surreal and humiliating night was shared with our close circle, friends, colleagues, and even her family. It wasn't an act of spite, but one of transparency. I wanted the truth to be out in the open. If she had destroyed our marriage with her actions, she wasn't going to rewrite the narrative or hide behind excuses. The reactions were as varied as they were intense. Some people were horrified, others speechless. Her parents, to their credit, reached out to me, not to defend her but to express their disbelief and shame. "We had no idea," her mother said over the phone, her voice heavy with regret. Friends who had been close to both of us struggled to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the person in the video. The fallout was swift and brutal, her social connections unraveled almost overnight. I didn't think much about how she might react. My focus was on moving forward and ensuring that people understood why I had taken such drastic steps to end our marriage. But as the days turned into weeks, I should have known that this wouldn't be the end of it. The first sign came late one evening when I heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. I rushed to the front of the house, heart pounding, to find her standing outside with a rock in her hand and fury in her eyes. One of the windows was completely smashed, shards of glass glittering on the ground. She was yelling, her voice raw and filled with venom. "You ruined my life," she screamed, her words slicing through the night. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to process the scene before stepping outside to confront her. Her rage was unrelenting. "You had no right," she shouted, advancing toward me. "You've turned everyone against me. My parents, my friends, everyone. How could you do this?" I didn't respond immediately, letting her words hang in the air. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, deliberate. "You did this to yourself," I said. "All I did was show people the truth. If you're angry about the consequences, maybe you should take a hard look at your actions." That only seemed to fuel her anger. She hurled insults at me, her voice cracking with desperation. It was clear that she was unraveling, the weight of her choices finally catching up with her. Neighbors began peeking out of their windows, drawn by the commotion, but I barely noticed. My focus was on keeping the situation from escalating further. I told her to leave, my tone firm but not aggressive. "This isn't going to fix anything," I said. "If you keep this up, I'll have no choice but to call the police again." Her expression shifted for a moment, as if she were considering the reality of her position. But instead of backing down, she doubled down, picking up another rock and threatening to throw it. I stepped back inside and dialed the police, making it clear that I wasn't going to engage further. When the officers arrived, she was still pacing outside, shouting obscenities. They escorted her away, and I was left standing in the quiet aftermath once again. The broken window would be repaired, but the scars of the night's events would linger, a reminder of just how far things had spiraled out of control. A few days after the incident with the broken window, her parents showed up unannounced at my door. I wasn't surprised to see them. They'd been reaching out periodically, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. This time, though, their visit was different. There was a sense of urgency in their expressions, a kind of weariness that spoke to the strain this situation had placed on them as well. I let them in, gesturing for them to take a seat in the living room. Her mother started speaking first, her voice calm but tinged with desperation. "We're here to ask for your help," she said. "We know what she's done is unforgivable, but we're begging you to reconsider the legal action. We'll pay for the damages, everything, if you'll just agree to let this go. Please, she's already lost so much." Her father nodded solemnly, adding, "She's not in a good place right now. We're just trying to keep her from falling apart completely." I leaned back in my chair, processing their words. Their offer wasn't unreasonable, and I could see the pain in their faces. They were clearly grappling with guilt and embarrassment over their daughter's actions, trying to clean up a mess that wasn't entirely theirs to fix. For a moment, I considered sticking to my guns, letting the legal process play out. But as I looked at them, I realized that prolonging this battle wasn't going to bring me any real satisfaction. "All right," I said finally, my tone measured. "I'll drop the charges. But let's be clear about one thing, this isn't for her. This is for you. She's made her choices, and now she has to live with them. If this is the last favor I do for her, so be it. But don't expect me to believe she's learned anything from this." They both nodded, visibly relieved, and her mother reached out to squeeze my hand in gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "You have no idea what this means to us." True to their word, they covered all the expenses, the broken window, the legal fees, and anything else related to the chaos she had caused. I appreciated their willingness to take responsibility, even if their daughter couldn't. It felt like closure of a sort, though not the kind I had hoped for. Still, it allowed me to move forward without the shadow of ongoing legal drama hanging over my head. Not long after, I heard through mutual acquaintances that she had moved in with her best friend instead of staying with her parents. It didn't surprise me. Living under their roof probably came with too many rules and reminders of her failures. Her friend, on the other hand, had always been an enabler, someone who would let her live as recklessly as she pleased without judgment. To me, it was just further proof that she hadn't truly grasped the gravity of what she'd done. While her parents hoped this ordeal would be a wake-up call, I wasn't so optimistic. She'd managed to avoid the worst of the consequences, and now she was back to surrounding herself with people who would indulge her worst tendencies. It was disappointing, but not surprising. As for me, I felt no need to dwell on her choices any longer. I had done my part, extended a courtesy that she likely didn't deserve, and now it was time to focus on rebuilding my own life. If she wanted to continue down a path of self-destruction, that was her business. I'd already wasted enough energy trying to save her from herself. This was the end of the road as far as I was concerned. Her parents sent me a final note of thanks a few weeks later.